Hello everyone. Here we're going to be talking about the cardiac muscle tissue. Therefore, if we were to do a section through the wall of the heart, it would reveal three distinct layers, which are the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. But before we dive into these three layers, let us use this image to review what we covered on the previous learning outcome. Remember that we have two membranes that wrap up the heart and the major blood vessels. These were the outer fibrous pericardium and the inner serous pericardium. Also, if you recall, the serous pericardium was divided into two layers, the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. The fibrous pericardium and the parietal pericardium are going to be firmly attached to each other with no space between them. And this is exactly what is represented here on this image. And then we have a space between the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. You guys remember the name of this space? If you said pericardial cavity, you are correct. And this space will be occupied by the pericardial fluid. And all this is just a review. There was one more important concept that we talked about on the previous learning outcome, and this was the fact that the visceral pericardium formed the epicardium, remember? Which is the outer membrane of the heart wall. Now we will build on this knowledge and talk about the other two layers of the heart wall. The one in the middle is the myocardium, which represents the actual cardiac muscle tissue. Therefore, here is where you will find the cardiomyocytes, which are the heart cells, in addition to associated connective tissue, blood vessels, which are going to be represented here by these red and blue circles, in addition to some nerves that are not represented in the image. And the thickness of this layer will depend on the amount of work it has to exert. In other words, how much it needs to work to push the blood from one compartment to the other. You should be thinking about which heart compartment is going to be exerting the least amount of work and which ones are exerting the most amount of work to be able to expel the blood into the next heart compartment or outside of the heart. Let's take, for example, the blood that is inside of the right atrium. First, you need to think, where will this blood go to from here? If you thought of the right ventricle, then you are correct. Do you think that the heart muscle needs to exert a big effort, or in other words, it needs to contract forcefully to be able to push the blood from the right atrium into the right ventricle? I would say that it does not. And why is this? Well, since the right atrium is above the right ventricle, the blood will move down just with the gravity. This makes sense, right? Therefore, notice how the wall of the right atrium is not very thick. Now let's look at the left atrium. How about the left atrium? Where will the blood from this compartment go to? If you thought of the left ventricle, you are 100% correct. Do you think that this blood will move down into the left ventricle the same way as it occurred on the right side? Yes, of course it will. And it makes sense that this will happen. So it doesn't have to do a lot of work to be able to push the blood from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Therefore, do you expect the walls of the left and right atria to be about the same thickness? Yes, we do. And this is exactly what we see on the image. Now let's move to the ventricles. Let's start with the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, where will this blood go to? It will be expelled to the lungs through this big artery, which is called the pulmonary trunk. And from there, it will complete the pulmonary circuit, going to the lungs and then returning back to the heart. How about the left ventricle? Where will the blood go from here? Well, it will leave the heart through the aorta and then complete the systemic circuit, taking blood everywhere in the body except for the lungs, right? Therefore, do you think that the force of contraction in the right ventricle should be the same as the force of contraction in the left ventricle? If you said yes, you are incorrect. And the reason for this is because the lungs are right next to the heart compared to, for example, the brain or the organs in your abdominal cavity. Therefore, it makes sense that the left ventricle has to be more aggressive when it is contracting to make sure that the blood reaches all the organs that are spread throughout our body. And for this reason, the wall of the left ventricle will be thicker than the wall of the right ventricle. The same thing would occur if you went, for example, to the gym and just worked out your left biceps brachii. Your left arm would look bigger than your right arm, correct? Here is the same concept. Therefore, when we compare the heart wall of the right and left ventricles, we will notice that the wall on the left side is going to be thicker than the wall on the right side. And this does make sense. Like everything makes sense. Moving on, we have the last layer, which is the endocardium. Endo means in or within. Therefore, it is the internal layer of the heart wall. In fact, it will be continuous with the endothelium, therefore made of simple squamous epithelium. It will also contain a thin layer of fat that's formed by the areolar connective tissue, as we can see from the image as well. Since it is the most internal layer, it makes sense that it will cover the inner surface of the heart in addition to the valves as well. And we haven't talked about valves yet, as these structures, they will be covered on the fifth learning outcome of this module. But on this image, we can see 3 of the 4 valves that are present in the heart. We have the right atrioventricular valve, which, like the name says, will sit between the atrium and the ventricle on the right side. Then we have the same type of valve on the left side, and it makes sense that it will be called the left atrioventricular valve. In addition, we can see a valve right at the entrance of the pulmonary trunk, and this valve will be called the pulmonary valve. And the main functions of the valves is to prevent the backflow of blood. In other words, it will prevent the blood from moving back to the original compartment. But right now, you guys don't have to worry much about the valve functions because we will cover it in more details as we move along in learning outcome number 5. Now let's focus on the cardiac muscle tissue, or the myocardium. The cardiac muscle histology is actually unusually characteristic, and this gives it a unique functional property. We did talk briefly about cardiac muscle tissue when we discussed the different types of tissues in ANP1, and the cells that form the cardiac muscle tissue can be called either cardiocyte or cardiomyocyte, where the added word myo just means muscle. From the image, we will notice that these cells, they will contain a single central nucleus. And although cardiomyocytes are much smaller than skeletal muscle cells, they are similar to skeletal muscle cells in that each cardiomyocyte contains organized myofibrils, and the alignment of their sarcomeres are going to produce the striations, as we can see from this image. Another difference is that the cardiomyocytes, they branch out and the skeletal muscle cells do not. They actually form this very long cylindrical shape. Here are some additional and very important ways in which cardiomyocytes are going to be different. First, we can say that cardiomyocytes are almost totally dependent on aerobic respiration to be able to obtain the energy that is needed to continue contracting over and over and over and over again. Therefore, the cardiomyocytes, they will contain several mitochondria, and they're also going to contain abundant reserves of myoglobin to be able to store oxygen. And these energy reserves, they're going to be maintained in the form of either glycogen or lipid inclusions. Then we can say that they will have this relatively short T tubules, and these will not form the triads with the sarcoplasmic reticulum as we saw them in the skeletal muscle. Also, we can say that the circulatory supply of the cardiac muscle tissue is going to be more extensive even than that of the red skeletal muscle tissue, which makes sense since the heart is going to be continuously contracting. Then we can say that cardiomyocytes contract without instructions from the nervous system, and this function is referred to as autorhythmicity, meaning that their contraction rhythm is going to be auto-generated, and we will definitely talk more about this on the next module. Then we can say that cardiomyocytes are going to be interconnected by these specialized cell junctions that are called intercalated discs, which are represented on this image. This means that these intercalated discs are going to hold neighboring cells together. And this is what makes them contract in unison, contract together, meaning that when one cell contracts, all other cells will contract as well. And because of this, the cardiac muscle has been called a functional syncytium. Syncytium means that it's a fused mass of cells. And just as a note, the intercalated discs, they are only found in cardiac muscle tissue. And last, we can say that there's going to be the presence of gap junctions as well to allow communication between the cells. And this means that they will be able to exchange ions and small molecules, for example, between these gap junctions on the cell membrane. And this will create a direct electrical connection between the two adjacent cells.